I know I sure made a ton of mistakes when I was first getting started with photography. It was really frustrating, and often it took years before I was able to correct those mistakes. Now, the worst part about it is that oftentimes you don't even realize that you're making a mistake until much further down the road. And then you realize when looking back at your older images that you were making that mistake. So I want to help you guys avoid some of the most common pitfalls made by photographers, especially landscape and nature photographers. And I want to get you on the fast track to help you guys to take amazing photos. Hey guys, I'm Austin James Jackson, a landscape photographer based in the beautiful southern Utah. In today's video, we're going to be talking about 5 mistakes that beginner photographers make and how to either avoid or fix these mistakes. Hopefully this video will be as helpful to you as it would have been to me when I had first started out with my photography. Let's just get started with the first mistake. Now, mistake number 1 is a classic. I see it all the time, especially amongst landscape and nature photographers. Of course, we all want those fiery red sunsets, but sadly, we do not always come up successful. This common mistake involves adjusting the white balance of your images to warm up the photo, which does make the sky and clouds look nicer, but it hurts the overall look of the photo because you now have an image that is too warm. So I strive to take realistic looking photos, and if you do too, you'll definitely want to listen up and avoid making this mistake. Let me show you guys how I adjust the white balance in Lightroom in order to avoid doing this. Got my image here in Lightroom. It's looking pretty good so far, but the problem is you can see it's far too warm, and maybe you don't even notice it yet, but when I cool it down, I think you will. So I'm in the Develop tab here. I'm going to go over to the temperature and the tint. I think I just need to adjust the temperature, but we'll see. Now, the problem is as I continue to make this warmer, you can see the sunset, or this is a sunrise actually, looks a lot better. But the problem is my rocks don't look realistic. They're too warm. Now I'm okay with there being like warm on the lake, but the key indicator here is that in the shadows, like of this rock, this should be either cool or neutral toned because it's in the shadows. Same thing with like some of these shadows over here, and they're all really warm. So I want to just keep cooling this down until we get to a more neutral spot. Somewhere about in there looks pretty nice. I'm really happy with the temperature now in the rocks. You can see the rocks are more neutral toned like granite should be. We still have a pretty good sunset. Now, sure, the sunset or sunrise, looked a lot better like this, but the whole photo looks more realistic like this. Now, you can make a selective adjustment to just adjust the sky if you want, but I usually try and avoid doing that, especially if you're newer. I wouldn't mess with that at all, but that is what I did with this image. I really had to cool it down. Coming out of the camera, it came out super warm, so I had to go ahead and cool that down, which ultimately resulted in a final image that ended up looking like this. It's still a little bit warm. I might even cool this final image down a little bit, but it is a lot better than it would have been had I just edited it straight out of the camera. So the second mistake involves a common photography rule, or even a myth if you want to call it that. You'll hear a lot of photographers talk about how important it is to watch your histogram and make sure absolutely nothing is blown out or totally dark. Now, while you do want to keep a balanced exposure, don't worry about having a slight spot in your image blown out, especially if you're shooting right into the sun, or if a small part of your image is completely dark if it's in the really deep dark shadows. So I strive to have images with a full range of tonality spanning from the brightest of highlights to the darkest of shadows. This gives my image excellent dynamic range, which I personally think looks really nice on photos. Avoid pulling down the highlights slider too much if you're shooting directly into the sun. Being able to see the ring of the sun, in my opinion, just looks completely terrible. You'll want to avoid having photos that look like this. Now, embrace a slight blowout around the sun if you are shooting into the sun, and let the brightness taper off as it naturally would. I think this just looks fantastic, and you can totally feel free to blow out a little area around the sun. It's not ideal to blow out places in the sky that's not the sun, but if you are shooting into the sun, don't worry about having a little blowout there a little bit around the sun. Now, mistake number 3 is something I think that most landscape photographers struggle with, especially when they're new. We all want to capture the big wide angle scene, but sometimes the light just does not lend itself well to the wide angle image. I used to shoot almost exclusively at 18 millimeters, but since I've matured as a photographer, I now almost exclusively shoot with my 70 to 300, almost always at 300 millimeters, which might be weird to you when you talk to a landscape photographer, but there's a lot of pros out there if you talk to them that are using the crap out of their telephoto lens. I still love to get those wide angle shots shots when the opportunity presents itself. But even with how much time I spend out shooting, which is probably more than a lot of you guys, those chances are very few and far between, unfortunately. So you're going to be able to capture very few great sunsets or sunrises a year. You're not going to get a lot of crazy great portfolio images if you're just locked into using your wide angle lens. So use your telephoto lens. You'll be able to get a little bit better photos, in my opinion. Not only am I able to capture unique compositions, but I can also focus on a very small part of the scene with my telephoto lens, chasing just the very best slivers of light. Now, when the skies are blue, look to your telephoto lens to find finer details in the gray landscape in order to still come away with portfolio quality images. Too often I see photographers try and force good conditions and end up with subpar images because they're including uninteresting elements in their scene. Most notably, this is like a clear blue sky. With a telephoto lens, you can cut through all the clutter, focus on a central subject, and produce a much more intriguing image. Now, mistake number 4 is a tough one, but it is worth mentioning, and that is you're either over or you're under editing your image. Of course, just like any other art form, photography is subjective to the viewer, and your opinion on over or under editing may be very different than mine, but I'll share my opinion anyways because you're here. First off, I think that 90% of the people that are making this mistake are over editing. If you're trying to turn your photo into something it isn't, you're doing too much and you're over editing. Now, while it can be done, and there's a few professional photographers who are very good at this, if you're new, you probably are not going to be getting the best results. I used to try and make my photos something that they weren't, and when I look back, sometimes I cringe at the images that I tried to force over the years. If the composition wasn't ideal, the conditions weren't great, just go ahead and get rid of the image or save it for later and move on. Oftentimes, photographers will over edit by adding too much contrast or too much saturation, or even using the presence sliders, the dehaze and the texture sliders in Lightroom. Those are really brutal if you overuse them. So a lot of different ways that you can over edit, but these are some of the most common. When it comes to under editing, usually photographers aren't using enough contrast or color. It's really hard to say what boat you'll fall into if you are making the over or under editing mistake. But I think if you honestly review your images and you think hard, you can usually tell if your images are either over or under edited, depending on your style. As I mentioned previously, I like to have my images to have a very wide tonality range between highlights and shadows in the image. So if your photo is lacking this, you're probably under editing. You might need to add more contrast, though some images are meant to be low contrast, which is totally fine. Like I said, it can be hard to tell, but the best way to determine if you're over or under editing your images is to just honestly review your own work or ask someone who will be honest with you, or even probably the best way is to get a portfolio review. A lot of professional photographers do portfolio reviews. You show up, show them your images, and they give you honest feedback on it. Or if you don't have the budget for that, email me a few images. I would be happy to give you guys some feedback. I'll include my email down below. Now, mistake number 5 is also so incredibly common, and it's that you're spending way too much time chasing clouds and not enough time chasing light. Ideally, you're going to get both, but the light is so much more important when it comes to clouds. When I look back at some of the best sunrises and sunsets I've captured, the images are just a little flat without some form of sunlight. The best time to shoot I've found is moments before the sun sets or moments after the sun rises, when the sun is first striking the landscape. Now, while the clouds are usually not the absolute best color at this time, you have to remember light is king. Pro photographers often take multiple images, one where the clouds are best, which is usually 15 minutes after sunset or 15 minutes before sunrise, and then they take another image when the sunlight hits. They can then blend these images together to make a much better overall image that looks really realistic. If you're interested in learning how to do that, I'm going to include a link to that video right here. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe to the channel if this video helped you. We'll see you next time.